Welcome to Global Truth. This is your host, Dr. Nasir Baig. On July 16th, 2026, President Donald Trump stood at the podium in the East Room of the White House to deliver a primetime address to the nation. Ostensibly framed as the report on national security and election integrity, the speech quickly turned into a high-stakes political showdown. The president announced the immediate declassification of previously restricted intelligence documents. He alleged that elements within the intelligence community, which he termed the deep state, had actively concealed evidence of foreign interference, specifically from the Chinese Communist Party during the 2020 election cycle. Concurrently, the address served as an ultimatum to Congress to immediately pass the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Save America Act. The proposed legislation mandates strict national requirement for voter identification and documentary proof of citizenship, such as a passport or a birth certificate, to register for federal elections. To supporters, the address was a long overdue exposure of systemic vulnerabilities and foreign threats to American democracy. To critics, civil rights advocates, and legal scholars, it signaled something far more disruptive: the construction of a legal and political predicate for the White House to declare a national election emergency, paving the way for executive intervention in the upcoming 2026 midterm elections. So this actually has a three-stage blueprint to understand the mechanics of what critics describe as an attempt to alter election rules outside traditional legislative channels. One must analyze the strategy unfolding across media, legal, and executive spheres. The plan rests on a three-stage sequence. Stage 1, declassification and public narrative construction. The initial move relies on releasing selective declassified intelligence materials to establish a public record of foreign threat. By highlighting CIA cables and National Intelligence Council assessments pointing to Chinese interest in influencing US political sentiment, the administration creates a justification grounded in national defense. Stage 2, the assertion of emergency authority. If Congress refuses to pass sweeping voting changes, the strategy calls for invoking statutory executive powers under the National Emergencies Act, NEA, or the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. By framing foreign cyber activities or vote registry vulnerabilities as an active threat to national sovereignty, the White House could claim extraordinary authority to issue executive orders altering election procedures. Stage 3, administrative bypassing of state election infrastructure. Through emergency declarations, executive directives could attempt to bypass congressional gridlock. These measures might include restricting mail-in voting, mandating federal voter roll purges, demanding strict in-person citizenship verification, or challenging state-level voting machine certification. From here, we must look into the key players and the media architecture, because this narrative did not just emerge in vacuum. It is the product of an ecosystem combining conservative media networks, legal strategists, and grassroots activists. The overarching emergency strategy relies on two distinct but coordinated operational wings: the legal and strategic anchors and the media and advocacy drivers. On the legal and strategic front, figures such as Cleta Mitchell works alongside conservative legal networks and White House legal counsel to build the constitutional and administrative framework required to justify executive intervention. Operating in tandem, media and advocacy drivers led by Steve Bannon, John Solomon, and Bill Pulte focus on public messaging, mobilizing grassroots pressure, and circulating declassified documents to build monument for executive action. Let's have a look at them one by one. Let's have a look at, first of all, Steve Bannon and his media campaign. Former White House strategist Steve Bannon has repeatedly used his broadcasting platforms to socialize the concept of an election national emergency. Bannon argues that traditional legislative fixes are too slow to counter foreign infiltration and that executive action is the only viable path to protect the midterms if we are to be safe. Now let's come to Cleta Mitchell. Conservative attorney Cleta Mitchell, a prominent figure in post-2020 election challenges, has convened coalition of election integrity activists. Mitchell and her allies have publicly advocated for the administration to exercise emergency executive authority to standardize election rules and enforce strict citizenship checks across all 50 states. Now let's see what John Solomon is offering. Solomon and related media outlets have served as primary conduits for publishing declassified memos and reporting on administrative disputes within the intelligence community. These reports focus heavily on allegations that senior bureaucrats suppressed findings regarding Beijing's effort to influence US politics. Now, the financial and public support which Bill Pulte is looking after. Figures like philanthropist and investor Bill Pulte have used their public platforms and financial resources to amplify calls for immediate election reform, aligning closely with the administration's push for the Save America Act. Now let's have a look at the legislative blush, the Save America Act. At the center of the policy debate is the Save America Act. The administration presents the bill as a common sense measure to restore public confidence. The core mechanism of the Save America Act is its absolute mandate requiring documentary proof of US citizenship to register to vote in federal elections. Proponents view this as an essential security measure, arguing that strict documentation prevents non-citizen voting, restores eroded public trust in election outcomes, and secures state voter rolls against administrative vulnerabilities. Opponents, however, contend that non-citizen voting is already illegal and virtually non-existent in measurable terms. They emphasize that requiring documents like unexpired passports and specialized birth certificates risks disenfranchising millions of eligible American citizens, particularly low-income individuals, students, rural residents, and elderly voters who lack immediate access to such documentation, thereby creating severe intentional barriers to registration. Now, what the intelligence assessments actually say, now have a look at that as well. To evaluate the administration's claim regarding foreign interference, one must cross-examine the newly declassified documents with the broader findings of the US intelligence community. Now, let's go through the key intelligence assessment. National Intelligence Council report, what does it say of 2021? It says, China did not deploy interference efforts and considered but did not deploy influence efforts intended to change the outcome of the US presidential election. Now, let's dissect the claimed foreign threat. When examining the specific dimensions of foreign interference, a sharp contrast emerges between the administration's public assertions and the intelligence community's factual consensus. Regarding China's role in the 2022 elections, the administration alleges systemic infiltration and an active cover-up by foreign intelligence officials. However, the consensus among intelligence agencies remains that while Beijing evaluated options to influence the race, it ultimately chose not to deploy direct interference options due to the high risk of detection. On the question of compromised voter rolls, the White House claims Chinese operatives carried out a massive heist of American voter data. While intelligence analysts acknowledge that foreign state actors engaged in broader cyber reconnaissance, they confirmed that no state registers were altered and no vote tallies were impacted. Finally, while the administration frames these discrepancies as proof of a deep state cover-up designed to protect foreign interests, intelligence officials maintain that the released documents merely reflected standard internal debate and minority analytic opinions, all of which were routinely summarized in official public reports. Okay, now let's just look at the constitutional framework and legal limits. If the White House attempts to bypass Congress and execute election changes via an emergency declaration, it faces immediate constitutional and legal barriers. The foundation of American election law rests squarely on Article 1, Section 4 of the US Constitution, commonly known as the Elections Clause. Under this constitutional framework, primary authority over the times, places, and manner of holding federal elections is granted exclusively to individual state legislatures. The Constitution grants secondary oversight powers solely to the United States Congress, which may alter or make state regulations by federal statute. Crucially, the executive branch holds no explicit constitutional authority over election administration, meaning presidential attempt to dictate voting procedures, mandate registry purchase, or seize election machinery inherently clash with the separation of power. Now let's have a look at the Elections Clause, that Article 1, Section 4. The US Constitution explicitly assigns the authority to regulate the times, place, and manner of holding elections to state legislatures, with Congress holding the power to alter those regulations by statutes. The executive branch is granted no constitutional authority to unilaterally mandate election procedures or invalidate state voting laws. Now let's see what the statutory emergency limits are. Legal scholars note that neither the National Emergencies Act nor the International Emergency Economic Powers Act grants the president power over state-administered elections. Attempts to seize voting equipment, suspend mail-in ballots, or void state voter rolls via executive order would face immediate federal court injunctions. Now here, let's look at federalism and separation of power. Under the 10th Amendment, states retain sovereign authority over local administration functions. So any executive order attempting to federalize state election workers or override state voting statutes would trigger immediate lawsuits from the state attorneys general across the country. The battle lines over the 2026 midterm elections are clearly drawn. On one side is administration, and its allies frame their actions as a necessary defense against foreign interference and domestic administrative corruption. They maintain that strict voter identification and proof of citizenship are essential to protecting the integrity of the ballot. On the other side, civil rights organizations, legal scholars, and political opponents view the strategy as an unprecedented attempt to use emergency executive powers to reshape voting rules without congressional approval. Whether through stalled legislations, legal battles, or executive declarations, the debate over who controls America's election machinery remains one of the defining constitutional challenges of our time. And this just might define the future of United States of America. Thank you very much for watching Global Truth. Take good care of yourself.